right, hello and welcome to another session of Comics 101. And today we are delving into the history of comics. And when I first imagined that I would be covering this topic as part of my ongoing Comics 101 sessions, I thought I could hit the entire history of the industry in one go. But as I sat down and thought about it and started playing it out, I realized that I would be doing a huge disservice to the history of the industry if I tried to take it all in one, especially since I love it so much. I don't want to give short shrift in any way. So instead, I'm going to break it up into probably 3 parts. So today is going to cover the golden age of comics, from the dawn of time through roughly the 1950s. So thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy this very quick overview, which even in this form, we're not going to touch on everything that that comics are up to and about in the golden age, but we're going to hit the highlights. All right, but first of all, what are we talking about when we talk about comics? When you think of comics, you might think of an image like this, a superhero comic with somebody like Superman, bright, bombastic, colorful. Maybe it seems to some eyes a little bit silly, perhaps a little bit outmoded. But comics also include, quote unquote, serious, quote unquote, artistic, quote unquote, important works, such as Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, seen here, which is a graphic memoir about a young woman growing up in Iran during the revolution. And you might also think of or discover something like this, the work of R. Crumb, who's known as an underground comics master, so a little bit rougher, a little more absurd, socially aware, but also socially skewering. So the truth is that comics encompass all 3 of these highly divergent examples and so much more. They go from superhero stories suitable for kids to real world issues that kids and adults both can benefit from, to things that are probably really only suitable for adults or specific audiences. So comics are a wide spectrum. If you need a specific definition of comics, I like this one: words and pictures in a sequence to tell a story. This is a definition adapted from the work of Scott McCloud. If you want a great crash course in the structure of comics, what comics are and how they do it, his masterpiece is called Understanding Comics. The discourse around comic structure has certainly evolved since McCloud put the work out in the early 90s, but there is still much of value in McCloud's book to get you to understand comics. And it was from McCloud's work that I adopted this definition of words and pictures in a sequence to tell a story. And that sort of differentiates comics from like picture books, where words and pictures are together, but they're sort of accompaniments to one another. They don't necessarily gel in the same way that comic books do as a medium. And the notion of comics as a sequence of words and pictures, it goes back. It's not just comic books. There are some relatives of comic books and there are some ancestors of comics. And maybe one of the most obvious relatives of comics is the comic strip, such as this piece of our friend Garfield. Very funny Garfield. So this is a comic strip, not a comic book. As you can see, it's a complete piece in 3 individual panels. That's what you call the boxes that the pictures take place in. It doesn't go on for multiple rows of panels. It doesn't go on for multiple pages. So this is a comic strip, mostly appearing in newspapers, but also in other media these days. And comic strips themselves go back a ways. Here's a famous example of a comic strip from the late 19th, early 20th century, The Yellow Kid. This is all part of the lineage that has given us comic books. You can also think of political cartoons as being in the family of comic books. Obviously, words and pictures are working in concert here, and they are in sequence, even though there's only one image, because you still read it in a specific order, and there's a sense of time passing within the panel, because obviously these two lines cannot be spoken simultaneously. One comes first and then comes the second one. So another relative of the comic book. And just like the comic strip, political cartoons have been created and going on for many centuries now. So here's an example of a comic strip from an earlier era showing world powers carving up the planet. But you can even go back farther. Here is an instance of an etching that may have appeared in a book, and there are examples of books from, pretty much since printing was developed, and there were ways to print images in printed books, and etching was one of the ways that people did that. There were some books that functioned more or less like a book with an illustration, but there were others where the words and the pictures really blended together in a way that was very similar to comics. Going back even further, we have things like illuminated manuscripts. Again, in some ways, they're like illustration, but in other ways, the pictures and the words reflect each other, comment on each other, interact with one another in ways that are more complicated than simply being illustrative. You might be familiar with the Bayeux Tapestry, a detail of which is seen here. This is an historical artifact that depicts important moments in medieval history. And as you can see, it's mostly image-based, but there are some letters there and probably Latin. So it's telling a story in both words and pictures, conveying history in words and pictures. Even farther back, you've got ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, which were ways of expressing spoken speech using pictures. And you can go all the way back to cave paintings. So we've moved backwards through time here, and the point being is to show that we've been telling stories through pictures for all time. It's always been a part of our human culture. Even before we had the capacity for written language, we were using drawings to tell our story. Using pictures for narrative purposes isn't new, and despite what some might think of modern comic books, it's not vulgar or crude. It's not just for people who can't handle words. It's a strategy to convey information and meaning, and it's just as beautiful and versatile in its own unique ways as any other way of conveying information, whether we're talking about the written word in books or the lyric word in poetry and music. It's just another way of conveying information. So, when we look for the dawn of what we might consider the comics age, we do look at that, probably that first cousin on the family tree of sequential art lineage, comic strips. There was a time when there was no such thing as a serialized comic strip, where there might just be a single strip that appeared in a newspaper, an early newspaper, something like that, and that was it. If the artist continued to do more in the future, it would be a totally different story, different characters. But sometime in the mid-1800s, artists and writers started to serialize their strips, so you would have characters and storylines continuing from one to the next. And this proved incredibly popular. It turns out people like following a narrative that is longer than 2 or 3 panels long. And eventually, it became economically feasible for the publishers of these things to repackage ongoing strips into another format. So they would repackage them into collections. Initially, a lot of comic strips leading into the early 20th century were humor-based, but they did eventually give way in America, especially in the early 20th century, to other genres such as crime, thriller, action, and fantasy. If you're familiar with the pulp novel sensibility of the early 20th century, pulp dime novels, sort of hard-boiled pot-boilers, beautiful dames and tough-as-nail gumshoes sorts of stories, that sort of feeling started to suffuse comic strips. And then in 1929, there was a publication called The Funnies, a tabloid-sized magazine of reprinted newspaper comic strips. And that was released to great success. And this could be considered, even though it did not contain original material, but because of its format and the way it was packaged, it could be considered the first comic book. Things started to take off in a different direction in 1938 with this guy, and I think we all know who he is. You can't really live in American culture without having a sense of who and what Superman is. And Superman was introduced in Action Comics #1 from National Comics, and his huge immediate popularity cemented the superhero as the bedrock genre of this nascent comic book medium. Billed as a strange visitor from an alien planet, Superman, aka Clark Kent, nevertheless embodied corn-fed American values and stood as an avatar of strength, standing up for justice and the little guy. As it said in one of his early appearances, Clark Kent, quote, must turn his titanic strength into channels that would benefit mankind, and so was created Superman, champion of the oppressed. And Superman was created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, two Jewish cartoonists from Ohio whose story of an outsider embracing and being embraced by American values stood as an analogy of the Jewish experience in the United States, a pointed message in an era when the country was still holding itself apart from the conflicts in Europe, despite reports of the rampant anti-Semitism of the Nazi regime. National Comics, better known to modern audiences as the comic publishing giant DC, introduced a number of other important characters during the Golden Age. I won't go through them all, but some notable ones include, of course, Batman, another character that, because of his presence in pop culture, movies, TV shows, books, radio, internet features, and just being sort of the coolest guy around, it's impossible to take too many steps in American culture without knowing who Batman is. He was created in May 1939 by Bob Kane and Bill Finger. Sort of Superman's shadowy counterpart, he's a figure of fear battling in the underworld rather than a beacon of optimism. And he certainly spoke to something in our society as he quickly became as popular as Superman, who has often been characterized as a Boy Scout to Batman's mysterious and sometimes brutal detective. DC also introduced Wonder Woman in October 1941, created by William Moulton Marston. Wonder Woman was the first female lead in a superhero comic and one of the most enduring comics characters of all time. Marston was a psychiatrist who invented the polygraph, which might have something to do with why Wonder Woman carries a lasso of truth. And Marston had a unique romantic lifestyle involving a polyamorous relationship with two women who are credited with inspiring Wonder Woman. Their story is told in the film Professor Marston and the Wonder Women. Some other notable DC characters of the time include the Flash and the Green Lantern, but we won't get too much into them for now. But what's interesting about this moment in American history that comics, superhero comics in particular, are arising during is that they offered an escape during a really desperate period in American life, really two periods. First, the Great Depression, appearing as Superman did in the late 1930s, and then, of course, World War II. So these magazines were less expensive than books, And they also offered what the other big home entertainment medium of the day, radio, could not, visuals. So that was a big appeal for most people when it came to comic books. And historians have noted that it's not very well remembered now, but almost everyone read comic books in this era. It wasn't something that was seen as being something just for teenage boys or anything like that. Almost everyone read comic books. I should also point out that there's an array of comics from this period that are not well remembered, that nevertheless reflect a dynamic, creative, and diverse pool of authors and artists that explored issues of social justice and gender roles. And these are largely forgotten today due to factors that we'll discuss in a future session. I should say a couple of words about creators' rights, and unfortunately, the main word is non-existent. This will be a theme that remains constant through the history of comics, at least as regards the major comics companies, until the creator-owned revolution of the early 1990s. Comics companies owned their characters, they own the rights to them, they control their licensing and use in other media like TV and movies. Most of the creators of the Golden Age saw very little profit or prosperity, even as the characters they created skyrocketed in popularity and made buckets of cash for the owning corporations. Not a few of these creators would die in poverty and obscurity. Others were bogged down in disputes over who invented what, since no one was taking close notes in the early days when there was no expectation that individual characters would persist for decades. It's really sort of a sad underside of a story that on the surface is about aspirational figures combating injustice. So we've talked a lot about National Comics, which would become DC Comics, but there was another major comics company that served as the main competition to National, and that was Timely Comics, a scrappier company headed by the colorful Martin Goodman, and which would one day evolve into Marvel Comics. Now, Marvel is a household name today, but early on, these were the edgy countercultural comics of their era, owing more to the dark and gritty flavor of the pulp mystery hero than to the squeaky clean image of the Superman types. Namor the Submariner was arrogant and vain, a true anti-hero whose methods raised questions, no matter how reasonable seeming his aim of defending his undersea kingdom may have been. And then there was the Human Torch, who was viscerally horrifying in the way he'd burst into flames and fling fireballs at evildoers, with even his double life as an average square-jawed police officer unable to counterbalance that unsettling existence. And that image you see right now is the cover, part of the cover of the very first comic published by Timely Comics, where they introduced the Human Torch. So right from the get-go, they've showcased the unsettling sort of semi-diabolical vibe that this character gave off, even though he did turn out to be a pretty heroic type. So it's really interesting, these two characters, Namor and Human Torch, avatars of elemental forces of water and fire, would come together in the first great crossover in comics history, where the characters from one comic would appear in the pages of another's magazine. And instead of teaming up, they sort of set the stage for future superhero meetups where they were enemies and they were engaged in a huge battle that would see New York City drowned in a huge tidal wave summoned by Namor. And I've always just thought that this image is particularly affecting. Now, of course, we're getting towards World War II, and this grittiness that you see in the early issues of Namor and Human Torch's stories would start to wane as events hurtled towards America's entry into World War II. Even before Pearl Harbor, comic heroes reflected public opinion by getting involved in the war effort, stymieing Nazi saboteurs on the home front and traveling to Europe or the Pacific to smash freedom's enemies. Almost every popular hero got in on the act, but none would have the impact of a new hero created specially for the purpose of punching Hitler in the face, Captain America. I mean, look at that. His first appearance, the cover of his first issue, wham. It leaves little to the imagination in terms of the raison d'etre of this character. This national hero remains an essential comic book character to this day, to say nothing of his film appearances. And his co-creator, the young Jewish artist from Brooklyn named Jack Kirby, would shape comics with his imagination and ingenuity for the next 50 years and beyond. Now, comics in the early 40s were focused on the war and did an admirable job in promoting patriotism and unity. But with patriotism, especially in a medium still in its infancy, came an unfortunate strain of jingoism and racism. And I'm not going to show any examples of that because they're just not pleasant, and I choose not to. It's one thing for our comic books to pit our heroes against the armies of our real-world global opponents, but it's another thing to depict those opponents as subhuman, which is a trap that even the best comics all too often fell into. And these unfortunate racist tendencies weren't limited to America's enemies. These are artifacts of American culture of the time, and American culture was not kind to African Americans or Asian Americans, even when the supposed goal was to treat them sympathetically. So you would see a lot of depictions of characters of non-white races, extremely exaggerated, stereotyped. The drawings were bad enough, and then you'd read their word balloons, and it would be all kinds of broken English and dialect sort of writing that just went way over the top and was too much. And it would be a long time before comics really grew past that. Now, eventually the war did end. Here's American service members coming home. And after the war, comics characters and their creators started to lose a little bit of focus. The country didn't necessarily seem as interested in the medium if it didn't involve promoting a war effort. Some titles tried to pivot to America's new enemy, the communist USSR. Captain America, for example, was rebranded a commie smasher. But readers didn't immediately come along. Many of the timely comics characters came to an end, such as Namor and the Human Torch. Captain America limped along for a little while longer. The national characters were never quite as entrenched in the war stories, reverted to battling domestic crime and cookie-cutter sci-fi stories. Publishers began to look beyond superheroes to goose readership, experimenting with genres as diverse as romance, Western, medieval fiction, and more pronounced sci-fi. Most popular, for whatever reason, were true crime thrillers and horror titles. This became the heyday of Tales from the Crypt, published by EC Comics. And writers and artists weren't shy about the macabre. Covers soon depicted grotesque ghouls and dismembered bodies, which only hinted at the grim contents. Returning service members who had grown up reading comics and gotten through the toughest days of the war with the support of their favorite heroes fighting alongside them embraced these more adult tales that pulled no punches in dark theme and imagery. In a way, it reflected their experiences better than stories featuring square-jawed heroes rounding up mobsters. And these were incredibly popular. In fact, it was in this post-war period that the apex of comics profitability arrived. In 1948, the industry earned $78 million, which is amazing when you consider that each comic sold for a nickel or a dime. But the popularity and these changes brought pushback. Some observers looked on these new comics, aghast at their contents, and worried about the way they rubbed shoulders with more childish fare on the newsstand rack. These worries would find expression and voice at the highest level with the publication of a single book that would threaten to snuff out the comics industry altogether. And how is that for a cliffhanger worthy of a comic book? We are going to pick up with this the next time we revisit Comics 101 and the history of comics with the book Seduction of the Innocent by Frederick Wortham. But we will leave it at that for now. I hope you enjoyed our discussion of the Golden Age. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. If you have any comments, please leave a comment. We're happy to hear what you want to hear about. If there are any topics you would like to tackle in the future, once we are done with the history of the comics industry, I am very interested in hearing what you would like to hear about. All right. Thank you all for listening, and come back soon. We'll have some more. Thank you.